In this video, we're going to be talking about anonymous functions and function expressions. In the previous video, we learned the basics about functions, what they are, and how they work. But there's a lot more to it than that. So in this video, we're going to take a look at anonymous functions and function expressions, and much more. Okay, so let's start with anonymous functions. What is an anonymous function? Well, anonymous means something that doesn't have a name, and an anonymous function means exactly that. An anonymous function is a function that doesn't have a name. So usually in a function declaration, you type in the keyword function followed by the function name, and then any parentheses with optional parameters, and then the function body. But with an anonymous function, you don't have a name. So you write it kind of like this. So as you can see, you start with the function keyword and then you just immediately type in the parentheses. Usually you type in function, then some name, for example ABC, and then the parentheses, and that ABC will be the name of the function. But with an anonymous function, you just type in function and then parentheses. And then you put in the curly braces and the function body. So inside the function body, we will type console.log hi. So we'll log the string hi to the console. And then we put in the ending pair of curly braces. Also note that we wrap this whole function inside a pair of parentheses. This is a basic anonymous function, a function that doesn't have a name. But wait, if this is an anonymous function, how do we call it, right? Because usually when calling or invoking a function, you type in the function name, such as ABC, and then the parentheses, and the parentheses actually executes the function. But in this case, we don't have a name for this function. So how do we execute it? Well, if you run this code, as usual, nothing will happen. That's because code inside the function's body, such as console.log hi, doesn't get immediately executed. It's only executed when that function is invoked. But in this case, this function doesn't have a name. It is an anonymous function. So how do we call it? And how do we make sure that this code is actually executed? Well, in this case, because the function declaration doesn't have a name, unfortunately, like this, you can't do that. So this is just an example of anonymous functions. You won't usually write it this way because using this, you can't really do much. Because this is a function declaration without a name. Because it's a function, the code inside the function doesn't get executed, and because it's an anonymous function, you can't call it. In order to call this anonymous function, you need to assign it to a variable. So let's see how that works. So in this case, you first type in a variable name. So for example, var say hello. And then that equals to a function. So previously we've seen variables contain strings, booleans, arrays, numbers, and so on. However, variables can also contain functions as values. Yes, so they not only contain strings and numbers and booleans and stuff like that, but they can also contain a whole function as a value. So here we're declaring a variable named say hello, and we're assigning it an anonymous function. In this case, again, we're typing in function and then the pair of parentheses. We're not typing in any function name. This is an anonymous function. And then inside the function's body, this is where we define the code, the function body code, which will be console.log hi. So we'll log the string hi to the console. And then we put in the ending pair of curly braces. So this is an anonymous function written as the value of a variable. And now, although the function itself doesn't have a name, it's an anonymous function after all, but because we assign it as a value to a variable, the variable can be used in the place of a function name. So in this case, we can actually type in say hello, and then the pair of parentheses to execute the function, and then the code inside the function console.log hi actually gets executed, and we get the string hi logged to the console. So this works very similar to the function declaration, where you type in function, then say hello, then the pair of parentheses, and then function body. But in this case, instead of typing in function, say hello, then parentheses, we create a variable named say hello, and then assign it a value that's a function, an anonymous function. And that anonymous function contains the code we need to execute. And then the variable name can be used as the name to call that anonymous function. So say hello, and then the pair of parentheses to execute the function gives us the string hi logged to the console. This is also a way of creating functions, and creating functions this way is known as a function expression. So previously the method that we used was typing in function keyword, then the function name, such as function say hello, and then the pair of parentheses. That is known as a function declaration. And function expressions, which is creating a variable and then assigning it a function as a value, is known as a function expression. So the function that we just created here, say hello, is a function expression. We use the function expression syntax to create this function. And a function expression means creating a variable and then assigning it a function. Now, function expressions can also have named functions. So for example, like previously, we have a variable named say hello. So var say hello equals function hi and then parentheses. So here we're not using an anonymous function. We're declaring a variable and we're assigning it a named function. So just like we would function, then the function name, and then parentheses, that's what we're doing here. We're not using an anonymous function. We're using a named function. And then inside the function's body, we type in console.log hi. So we're logging the string hi to the console. Although you can have pretty much any type of code you want, you are just logging to the console just to illustrate the point of these functions here. And then we close the curly braces and the function body block. And now, just like the previous example, you can use the say hello, the variable name, as a name for this function. Say hello parentheses executes the function and logs to the console hi. However, just because this function has a name doesn't mean that you can use it to call it or invoke it. So for example, hi and then pair of parentheses actually gives us a reference error, because this function, although it's named, you can't call it by that name. Because it's assigned to a variable, you must call it and invoke it by the name of the variable. Which means if you want to call this function, you must call it by that variable name. Say hello and then parentheses. Just because the function has a name in its declaration, such as function hi parentheses, doesn't mean that you can call it by that name. That name won't work. So what's the use of naming functions in function expressions? Well, sometimes naming functions make it a bit easier to debug code and trace down where an error came from. But other than that, this is still a function expression, and the name of the function is say hello. That's what you should be calling it with. Now let's talk about a very interesting feature of JavaScript, IIFEs. These are known as immediately invocable function expressions, also known as self-executing anonymous functions. So in this case, we declare an anonymous function first. So we type in function, then parentheses, and then we start the function body. Inside the function body, we declare console.log hi, so log the string hi to the console. Then we put in the ending pair of curly braces, and then we wrap this whole function inside a pair of parentheses. So we put in the pair of parentheses, one at the start right before the function keyword, and another one right after the ending curly brace. And this is similar to the very first example of anonymous functions that we saw. We just type in function, then parentheses without any name. But previously we said that because this function doesn't have a name, you can't call it later on, and because it's a function, the code inside the function doesn't even get executed. So what's the point? The point is you can actually turn these anonymous functions into an IIFE, or immediately invocable function expression. These are known as self-executing anonymous function. So what you do is you want to execute this function automatically. So right after this function is declared, it gets executed. It's not executed later on. It's executed only once and immediately. And you do that by simply putting in a pair of parentheses at the very end. Okay? So in this case, because this function doesn't have a name, you can't call it later on. You also can't call it multiple times. So this is not very flexible, but it has a lot of uses, as you'll see later on. But for now, just know that in order to create a self-executing anonymous function, you declare the anonymous function and wrap it around in a pair of parentheses. That is the function declaration. And then in order to execute that function, you put in another pair of parentheses at the very end. That pair of parentheses is actually what executes the function. Because the function doesn't have a name, you use the whole function declaration to actually define the function and also execute it all at once. And that is how you use IIFEs. These are immediately invocable function expressions. this is an anonymous function that gets self-executed, which means that right after it is defined, it's executed. So if you run this code, unlike the very first example, we actually get the string hi logged to the console because this function is defined and it's immediately invoked at the same time, which means the code gets executed. However, because this function doesn't have a name, you can't call it or invoke it later on in your code like other functions. So usually with non-anonymous functions, you can define the function first and then you can call it later on in your code whenever you want, multiple times.